Hi again, everyone. If you could sit down and maybe quiet your conversations. I know there's a lot of networking going on. Please have a seat, Jenét. But we're so excited to have you here. Again, my name is Nierenberg. I am president and co-founder with Bernie Pollock of Food Tank, and we're so delighted to be here with Little Hers and the Cook's Nooks, and we don't have time, and so many great collaborators and partners. And we just saw a really, really complex video, and I want to go ahead and introduce my guest. Jenét DeCosta is the first chief of staff at Driscoll's. And for those of you who don't know, Driscoll's has been a family-owned company for about 100 years, and it works with over 900 independently owned operators around the world. So those berries that you see at your Whole Foods or your Safeway, there's a lot that goes into that, and that's what we're here to talk about today. But this video of the last harvest really touches on some complex issues around immigration policy, food workers, and really the food system in general. So I'm hoping, Jenét, that we can sort of dive right in and talk about what, I think many of us don't understand that immigration policy is so related to food policy. And I'm wondering if we can sort of start off with that comment.
Certainly. Thank you, Danny, and thank you, Food Tank, for the opportunity for Driscoll's to share the last harvest. For those of you that weren't able to see it at the screening earlier in the week, it will be more readily available in mid-April. But part of the reason that we were so interested in telling that story is berries require a lot of people in order to get them to the marketplace.
Right.
And so in our model, we have over 900 independent growers, as you mentioned, who employ their own staff, totaling over almost 150,000 workers that are seasonal workers, right? So it's getting the individuals who are seeking jobs to harvest berries, to lay drip and irrigation,
right,
to work the fields at the time when we need it in various climates and regions and seasonality. And so Driscoll's business model is to basically follow the sun. We try to provide consumers with fresh, delicious berries 52 weeks of the year. And in turn, we have to go to different places throughout, even California. There's different seasons within California. In Florida has a different season, in Mexico, to supply the U.S. market. And so it's getting those workers where the berries are when they're there. And
Absolutely.
As we've seen over the last time we had comprehensive immigration forum was in 1986, right? And
Wow.
so we've been trying to figure out how you can have something that's orderly and decent that allows people who are seeking jobs to be where employers have the jobs for them, albeit they're not year-round jobs.
Absolutely.
And so immigration reform is something that's very pertinent in agriculture. And so this story actually started out as a way just to tell our grower story, and as the documentary was being filmed and they were having these day-long sessions with these growers, they were finding that the number one issue that's on their mind is not having people there to pick the crop
Right.
when the crop is ready to be picked. And that is where immigration reform and the need for comprehensive immigration reform, or at least in the agricultural space,
Sure.
is so pertinent and important.
Absolutely. You talked about this idea of orderly and decent immigration policy. What does that look like?
So that looks like, we have lots of people who kind of came in through the 1990s and even, through the 2000s. And what we started to see in 2011-ish is that controls at the borders got more strict, right? And so you started to see more on the enforcement. And so people who were used to maybe coming up through central Mexico to northern Mexico to Yuma, through California, Washington State, and then working their way back down to piece together year-round work, found it a lot harder to do that, kind of post 9/11,
Right.
and then especially in the early 2010s when immigration border control got stricter. And so what we found is a lot of people got stuck.
Right.
And so they're working, they're settled, they settled in communities because they couldn't migrate as much, and they don't have the adequate documentation to be working legally. But they're working, and they're paying taxes, and they're contributing to society, and they're actually now have children here
Yep.
who are contributing to society. And so what Driscoll's has taken on is sort of our principles around immigration reform needing some sort of documentation for legal status to work while you're here for those who are already here. a viable guest worker program, because that population is aging, right? As more time passes, they are become older workers, and so you do need a flow of workers coming into the United States. And then also with DACA reform, understanding that these individuals did settle, they had families, and then they've got children that are in limbo. And so once you get the system sort of working, where you can provide legal status, where people can work freely in society as with proper documentation, that they can then save and build into their communities. And then you can have a guest worker program that allows for more people to come in to the system, so that growers have workers where the crop is, when the crop needs them. And then you can have also a system for verification, so that we don't find ourselves 10 years from now having this same conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm glad you brought up this idea of like how farm workers are really contributing to communities, because I think there are stereotypes that many people believe about farm workers, and part of what this film does is help change that.
Yes, it's one of the beauties of it is that you get to hear from 3 growers, as well as a crew master who's working for one of our independent growers, and you get to hear it from their voices. And a lot of times what people sometimes forget is there is economic opportunity. One of our growers in the video that's highlighted, worked his way up. He was a farm worker. He actually came in across the border. He eventually became naturalized citizen. But he and his brother started their operation, and out of necessity. There was lack of work in the Oxnard, California area. There was an opportunity. They pooled their money together, and then they were able to buy land so that they could then begin to farm the land, knowing the crops that they do, which in their case was raspberries and strawberries. And so it's really looking at sort of agriculture's changing face, has been changing for over 40 years. It's really about providing that economic opportunity, and they're in your neighborhoods and in your communities, and it's community-based businesses. Some are small and some are medium-sized. The access to capital really goes to the ability for a grower to scale. But most growers, whether they're multinationals or whether they're small, family farms, would tell you they are a community-based business.
So interesting. One of the questions I asked when we had the film screening to Soren Bourne, who's the head of North America operations for Driscoll, was that I was, sort of excited during the pandemic because there was more attention placed on all kinds of food workers, but especially farm workers and sort of the struggles they face. I think people who hadn't understood the knowledge that it takes to be a farm worker. This is not just a job anybody can do. You have to be very smart and capable of doing it. But, that these were unseen folks for so long, and now, this veil has kind of been lifted. I feel like that's dissipating now, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how we can keep farm workers sort of front and center and remind folks, all of us as eaters, that they touch all of the food that we eat every day.
Yes, so I think one quote as I was thinking through that always struck me is the first day of my intro to economics class. My teacher summed it up as economics is the study of how people eat, right? Because at the end of the day, it's the basic need that we have. And so even as you think through all the policies that go through, it's how do we eat? And so at the fundamental of any society is the people who provide you with your food. And so we can't forget the individuals that provide us with our food. And we also have to move away from this notion that agriculture is unskilled labor.
Right.
At Driscoll's, we actually have this program called Driscoll's University. We take people out into the fields and allow them to, pick strawberries for a day. And I remember when I went out, one of the growers that I was in his fields picking, and he said, well, you have a perfect pack of berries. I can't afford you. That's a 500 pack of berries. I was just so slow in trying to get these strawberries off of the vine. And so I think a lot of times what you tend to forget is, one, these are not really low-paying jobs. We pay piece rate in the type of crop and commodity that we have. And for it to be viable and for people to want to work in it, they actually have to be skilled. They have to be able to move and get the premiums. And so what we started to see in California is that in the peak of summer, when the berries are in abundance, you could make $25, $30 an hour picking. And so because it's skilled. I could not make that money because I'm too slow, right? So that's not the skill set that I have, and so I'm here talking to you. But it is for you to remember that is skilled labor.
Right.
That we are just trying to connect those individuals with that skill to pick and harvest berries with the crop when it's available to be picked. And that goes for other crops as well. It's a lot of skilled labor in agriculture. And when the country sort of shut itself down, and those of us that could hunker down, these were the individuals that were coming out in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of other natural disasters, and making sure that we had food on our table. And that's why it's so important that we make sure that they have legal status in order to continue to work. And it goes to the continuity of our communities. Those people kept our communities going when the rest of us were sort of being able to do things virtually.
Absolutely. And when farm workers feel safe, our food is safer. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
It is. There's a coalition that we've been working through with business, faith leaders, and the law enforcement to really look at the holistic nature of our communities and how we can make sure that people do feel safe, right? There was a period of time not too long ago which is why Driscoll got so vocal about immigration reform, where people just had fear leaving their house to go to work, right? And could you imagine just walking out of your house and not knowing that you're going to be able to make it to work, and that when you dropped your kids off at school, you weren't necessarily certain you're going to be able to make it back to pick them up from school and come home, and yet you still had to go in, put your hours, and do the hard work, and do that day after day after day. And that destabilizes communities. Right? So living in fear destabilizes your community. Having continuity, knowing that you have economic opportunity, you have a healthy environment, that all becomes the stabilizing factor that leads to a vibrant community and leads to reinvestment and the thriving resiliency that we need and no matter where we are and what we're doing.
Absolutely. I love that term, thriving resiliency. I want to go back for a second and talk about, so we talked about, this growing awareness of farm workers. How does that translate into better immigration policy? So people know, okay, farm workers are out there, they exist, they pick all of our food, we wouldn't eat without them. But how can we translate that into better policy?
You translate it into better policy because you realize there's people. They're not a monolith. They're not an idea. They're individual people who are going to work every day.
Right.
And we need to see them. Right? In the last harvest, while we do highlight 3 growers, we highlight farm workers as well. And you get to see them. You get to see them as people with families, as people with ambitions. And so if we start thinking of policy in terms of how does it affect people versus how does it affect an idea of a person, you start to get to real solutions of what's necessary, and those solutions become a lot more simpler than these more theoretical areas.
Absolutely, it's just about putting a human face on something that always had it there anyway. But yeah, reminding folks that these are real folks who are working hard, working harder than all of us do every day. We have to remind the farm workers are the hardest working people in the world. So I want to go back to something you brought up earlier, which is the aging status of farm workers. And we hear a lot how farmers are aging in the United States and frankly across the globe, but farm workers are also aging very quickly, I heard the other day.
They are aging very quickly. As I said, we started to see this influx in the 1990s of individuals coming into work, and then they got stuck. And we didn't have reform to really get us a viable guest worker program that is useful. Mm-hmm. And so what you're seeing is, I think in California, the status, the average farm worker is over 35 years old, and it's manual labor, right? So that does play a part into their ability and their longevity in that specific task of harvesting. And so when we start to think through where are those individuals who might be a little bit younger to come in, they're not necessarily where you would think they would be. If you went back, the birth rates in Mexico have cut in half in the last 20 years. And so you have to start to look at other areas where people are looking for economic opportunity. If you think of the Northern Triangle, which has been on the news, there are a lot of individuals that are looking for economic opportunity, right? There are communities are not stable. They aren't able to have that economic reinvestment, and so they need jobs. And they might not necessarily want to be in the United States or in Canada forever and ever and ever.
Sure.
They want to go back to their home and revitalize their home, but they need capital.
Right.
And so farm work, and the reason you started to see that migration, it provided an opportunity for individuals to get access to capital that they could then take back to their communities.
Absolutely, and that's really, really important. That's a huge part of this. You know, we've talked about how labor intensive farm labor is. It's very labor intensive. And I'm wondering how policy figures into some of the innovations that Driscoll's and frankly other companies are developing around indoor agriculture and that kind of thing. Things that might make it easier, not so hard on folks' bodies.
Yeah, so in the short term, we've actually been able to pilot in certain areas tabletop strawberries, which is really, really great. For those of you that have seen and had the opportunity to see traditional strawberry picking, you do bend over, right? It's low to the ground. You have to bend over to pick the strawberries. And so what some of our growers have instituted, we've piloted it, is tabletops. And so you're actually growing at mid-waist level. Mm-hmm. And so it becomes easier and more ergonomically friendly. There's also controlled atmosphere growing, which is a little bit more futuristic. There's a lot more things that go into that, including mitigating climate issues that we're looking at, as well as even just substrate and being able to move the plants and move the spacing and playing with space density, how the plants, going back to just traditional agriculture, how the fruit presents itself makes it easier for farmers or for harvesters to pick the fruit.
Absolutely.
And so as you start to think through those innovations, there's things that are very low tech and there's things that are high tech and the gamut in between. And when we think of policy with it, it really goes down to how do you accelerate that innovation? How do you make it more accessible to growers who could be small growers, right? So we don't want a small family grower who might have only 2 acres to be at a disadvantage to some of the larger growers who have more diverse portfolios.
Absolutely, and I think that's such a problem with a lot of the innovation and technology that we're seeing, that there's not a level playing field. And robotics are not something that Driscoll's can use for strawberries yet. It just doesn't work. But I wonder if you're thinking about things like artificial intelligence and big data and how those figure into sort of the future of what policy looks like for farm workers.
So I think when you think of big data, it's, we, in our enterprise, we deal with big data now, right? Every year we sell over 1 billion clams of fresh berries, right? And so that's 1 billion touch points of information that consumers are giving us back about their experiences and that growers are giving us about the growing methods, the practices, where it was harvested, when it was harvested, what was the soil like, what were the microorganisms. And so we have a lot of data. And so big data is here and we're wrestling with it. I think when you think through policy, it's how do you turn that data into action?
Yeah.
And then how do you turn it into action that gets us the society that we need?
Absolutely, absolutely. I wonder, when you're, you live in Washington, D.C., right?
Oh, I live in California.
Oh, you live in California. Sorry. But when you're talking to legislators and others on these issues, do they get it?
They do. I mean, right now there is hearings taking place in Washington, D.C. on the upcoming Farm Bill. They're trying to educate themselves. A lot of it is them hearing it from different folks. I'm in D.C. a lot. That's probably why you think I'm in D.C.
Sorry about that.
But I am actually a resident of California. And we go out and our job is to educate. Our job is to inform. But we also rely on our consumers to educate and inform. We rely on our customer partners to educate and inform because policymakers are taking in information from all their constituencies and they have to turn that into something that feels palatable. And so what I know we need is what I know we need from an agriculture standpoint. What we need is from how food as the sustenance for our world. And so you're going in and you're having that. But if we're both going in and we're saying, farm workers are important, they're people, they're our neighbors, they're with us, and they need legal status. And a politician and a policymaker hears that from you, and they hear it from me, and they hear it from all these individuals in the audience, then they're feeling compelled to act. When they don't hear it, they think everything's okay.
Right.
And so it's really making sure that we don't let up the gas on making sure we're doing that education and that advocacy every opportunity that we have.
So the last harvest, I feel like, is a powerful tool for eaters, consumers. But what other things can they sort of learn from Driscoll's that they can take, to their co-op, their grocery store, their legislator, et cetera?
So we currently have a phone to action campaign going. If you're just looking for language, it's because I keep plugging to you all to please go and talk to your policymakers about immigration reform. But there are tools out there. We've partnered with others, IFPA, the International Fresh Produce Association, if you're looking at it from an agriculture specific, when I'm talking about guest worker programs. But also if you talk to, the National Immigration Forum is another partner that we have. They're running the Phone to Action campaign, and they're working with other constituencies on all kinds of immigration issues. And so there are resources out there, depending on what avenue you want to learn more about. But when you're going to your retailers, it's really just saying, I do care about the entire food system. I care from the people who harvest it to myself who's going to consume it. And as long as more people know that consumers care, they'll take action.
I hope so. I really hope so. I don't know if I believe that to be true, but I do hope that that's the way it works, and that's the way it's supposed to work.
I do believe it works, Danny. I mean, I know it hasn't felt that way in a very long time,
sure.
Right? And sometimes I do feel like I'm, crying in the wilderness.
Right.
But it does, in a capitalist society, and there are benefits to a capitalist society, the market is in control. It's that consumers have to realize how much power they have because they represent the market. And we have to just make sure that we don't forget the people that really come out and show up for us and make sure that we're able to eat. That's our most basic need, is to be able to eat. And then it's safety. And so if the people who make sure we can eat don't feel safe, we've failed. And so if we can go forward and make sure that the people who feed us feel safe,
right,
can work and feel safe, can go back to their children and feel safe, have their communities feel safe, have economic opportunity and feel safe, we've succeeded.
Absolutely.
But we have that power, and we just have to remember as consumers, we do have power.
Yeah, absolutely, and we need to use it more and more. It's becoming increasingly important. I want to, you brought up the Farm Bill earlier, and I mentioned this the other day, that berries and fruits and other fruits and vegetables are considered specialty crops right now under USDA programs. And they shouldn't be. They're these are the foods that are most nutritious. And I'm wondering what you hope personally comes out of the next Farm Bill, so that we can change not just how farm workers are viewed, but how these crops themselves are viewed.
So that goes a little more to a grower issue than the farm worker issue. I think when you think of specialty crops, the hardest issue is most growers in specialty crops don't own the ground that they farm. And so it is a series of renting for short periods of time. A lettuce grower might be there for 45 days. They then swap out with a strawberry grower that might be there for about 6 months. They then swap out with a broccoli grower. And so you're getting these crop rotations, you're moving through, and you're going from location to location within a climate to grow. And so when you think of the Farm Bill in the past, specialty crops have kind of been either carved out in the last Farm Bill or excluded in previous Farm Bills, because there wasn't a real way to get those government incentives to the growers when they needed them. And what we're trying to figure out in this upcoming Farm Bill, which is why there's so many hearings on it, is how do you level that playing field? How do you make sure that there's incentives and there's programs that help these individuals who do not own the ground they farm on be able to sustain that ground for long term.
Sure.
We want to be here in 25, 50 years, but we also need to make sure that the people that are coming before us and after us are doing practices that also help us be there for another 25 and 50 years.
Absolutely. I wonder what, I know Soren, again, the head of Driscoll's North America, talked about regenerative farming, and I wonder how workers and producers are feeling about, this new term and what it means for them.
So I think one of the things when it comes to a policy, and I'm going to be a policy wonk for a quick second, is we have to be really, really careful of whether we're talking about it from a standard perspective or a theory perspective. And so when we think of regenerative farming, one of the things, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to go, how do you incentivize it, and what do you expect from it that it works in consideration with the food safety standards of a particular crop, where they're located, how you manage some of those issues, and what is the expectation. We have to be really, really clear that as we use certain terms, the theory of them and what it's striving to do doesn't get blended with what the requirements of it allow you to do. And so for where we are, for me, I struggle with regenerative agriculture as the standards, because the science hasn't been worked out and the policy hasn't been fully worked out yet of how that works with specialty crops and on-farm management.
We sadly are about to run out of time. I think this was such an interesting discussion. Let's give Jenét a round of applause. Thank you so much.